Hello and welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. U.S. President Donald Trump has signaled that a peace deal with Iran could come over the next week. He also said he has spoken with both Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and representatives of Hezbollah, adding that both sides had agreed to halt attacks. Here in Seoul, officials from Korea and the U.S. kicked off security consultations this morning to discuss Korea's nuclear power submarine program, as well as uranium enrichment and spent fuel reprocessing rights. The talks aim to implement the security commitments outlined in the joint fact sheet adopted last November. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang cited robotics as a potential area of investment in Korea ahead of his visit to Korea later this week. Huang is set to meet with the heads of Korea's major conglomerates, including SK, LG, and Naver, to discuss AI cooperation. We begin this morning with the latest in the Middle East, where the U.S. and Iran are sending conflicting signals over peace talks. While U.S. President Donald Trump signaled an agreement could be reached soon, Iran said Israeli strikes on Lebanon had led to a suspension of communications with Washington. Our Park Gun-woo starts us off.
U.S. President Donald Trump said there could be an agreement with Iran over the next week to extend the ceasefire and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Speaking to ABC News on Monday, Trump said that although it's not a simple deal for both sides, an agreement could be even better than a military victory. Taking to Truth Social, Trump said negotiations with Iran were progressing at a rapid pace. Earlier the same day, Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency reported that communications with the U.S. to end the war had been suspended in response to Israeli attacks in Lebanon. It also said Iran could fully block the Strait of Hormuz and warned that it could activate other fronts, including the Bab al-Mandab Strait at the entrance to the Red Sea, alongside Iranian allies. Tehran's foreign ministry said the U.S. bears direct responsibility for Israel's attacks in Lebanon and warned that a breach of the truce on one front would amount to a violation of the ceasefire on all fronts.
One of the clear reasons for the escalation of the crimes of the Zionist regime in Lebanon in recent days can be nothing other than the undermining of any possible prospect for diplomatic processes to lead to some form of improvement in the situation. And this responsibility again lies with the United States. These U.S. actions are not merely violations of the ceasefire.
Bagai also stressed that the Lebanon ceasefire remains a fundamental condition for any negotiations aimed at ending the conflict. In a separate social media post, Trump said he had helped mediate efforts to halt hostilities between Israel and the Iran-backed Hezbollah group in Lebanon through calls with both sides. He said no troops would be sent to Beirut and that any forces already en route had been turned back. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agreed to cease attacks, but warned that Israel would resume strikes if Hezbollah continued its operations. The Lebanese embassy in Washington also said Hezbollah had accepted a U.S. plan for a mutual cessation of attacks. While tensions remain despite the temporary ceasefire, Israel and Lebanon are scheduled to hold a fourth round of peace talks in Washington through Wednesday under U.S. mediation. Park Gun-woo, Arirang News.
Here in Seoul, Korea and the United States are opening security consultations on Tuesday to discuss Seoul's nuclear power submarine program, uranium enrichment, and spent fuel reprocessing rights, and shipbuilding cooperation. First Vice Foreign Minister Park Yun-ju and U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Alison Hooker are co-chairing the launch session at the Foreign Ministry in Seoul. The talks are aimed at putting into action the security commitments set out in the joint fact sheet adopted last November, following summits between Presidents Lee Jae-myung and Donald Trump. Detailed talks will be led by the two countries' national security offices, with officials also taking part from foreign affairs, defense, energy, science, industry, and nuclear safety agencies. Seoul says the meeting will move directly into working-level negotiations, rather than remain a formal opening session. 1 year into the EU administration, its foreign policy has been characterized by pragmatic, national interest-based diplomacy aimed at navigating a challenging external environment. Our Kim Bo-kyung reports.
The Lee Jae-myung administration began its term facing the challenges of dealing with a new U.S. tariff environment and restoring South Korea's credibility after it was damaged by the martial law crisis. The Lee administration pursued a diplomatic strategy centered on pragmatism, grounded in national interests. Since taking office in June, President Lee has devoted considerable effort to summit diplomacy, actively participating in major multilateral events. Starting with the G7 summit in Canada, Lee also attended the ASEAN summit in Malaysia and successfully hosted the APEC summit in Gyeongju. Dealing with U.S. President Donald Trump's America First policies, President Lee held summits with Trump twice in August and October 2025. During the latter summit in Gyeongju, South Korea succeeded in reducing the reciprocal tariffs on Korean exports to the U.S. from 25% to 15%, and pledged approximately $350 billion in investment in the U.S. In return, South Korea also secured U.S. support for the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines, as well as expanded authority regarding uranium enrichment for nuclear power plants and the reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel, with the agreements documented in the joint fact sheet. Though follow-up discussions regarding agreements have been relatively stalled, due to an unexpected dispute involving Kupang, one expert says that the Lee administration held its own in ties with the U.S.
South Korea has proactively aligned with the U.S. alliance modernization agenda through higher defense spending, OPCON transfer, and greater responsibility for deterring North Korea, earning recognition as a model ally from Defense Secretary Hegseth.
The Lee administration's pragmatic diplomacy was reflected in improved relations with China and Japan. State visits between President Lee and Chinese President Xi Jinping helped improve bilateral ties, while exchanges with Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi strengthened cooperation on energy security and supply chains. In terms of tensions on the Korean peninsula, not much progress has been made, with North Korea doubling down on defining the ties with the South as two hostile states. Another expert says stability is being maintained in its own way and that the government should keep its two-track approach.
Despite the current stalemate in inter-Korean relations, stability has largely been maintained. South Korea should continue to deter North Korea's nuclear and missile threats while remaining open to dialogue and cooperation when opportunities arise.
The success of President Lee's pragmatic diplomacy will ultimately be measured by its ability to deliver tangible economic and security benefits. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Korean and African nations agreed Monday to strengthen economic and strategic cooperation, with a focus on supply chains, critical minerals, and infrastructure development. The commitment was made during the Korea-Africa Foreign Ministers meeting in Seoul, attended by representatives from Korea and 50 African nations. The two sides discussed the impact of global challenges, including conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine, and highlighted Africa's growing importance in global trade routes and resource security. They also pledged to improve market access, expand economic partnerships, and deepen cooperation, while South Korea reaffirmed support for Africa's regional economic integration efforts under the African Continental Free Trade Area. The official campaign period for the June 3rd local elections comes to an end at midnight tonight, bringing 13 days of campaigning to a close. For more on what to expect at this year's elections, we're joined today by An Jun-sung, an attorney in South Korea. Thanks for coming on today.
Good morning.
So early voting for the local elections saw a record turnout this year of more than 23%. Both parties are interpreting the high turnout very differently. How could the strong early voting turnout affect the outcome of this year's election?
Yes, the record high early voting turnout is politically significant, but it should not be read as the indicator of a victory for either side. In most cases, high early turnout reflects intensity rather than a direction, which means that it tells us voters are engaged, not necessarily who they support. So both camps are likely engaged in selective interpretation, like, as you said, framing the data as evidence of their own momentum. But analytically, the deciding factor is the composition rather than the volume by itself, which democratic and then political groups actually turn out early. So unless we see a corresponding surge in the election day turnout or clear asymmetry in the voter composition, early voting figures alone are unlikely to determine the outcome.
I see. And local elections have traditionally seen lower voter turnout than presidential elections. What factors do you think contributed to this year's record high early voting turnout? And could it actually lead to higher turnout on the actual election day?
Well, this year's early voting surge reflects a combination of structural and political factors. Structurally, the early voting has become normalized in South Korea's electoral culture, reducing the barrier to participation. Politically, heightened polarization and competitive local races have increased the perceived stakes, pushing both parties to mobilize supporters earlier than usual. However, there is a critical distinction between timing and total participation. Early voting often redistributes turnout rather than expanding it. So whether it translates into higher overall turnout will depends on whether political engagement remains elevated through the election day, particularly among the marginal or undecided voters.
I see. And rival parties also clashed after President Lee encouraged people to vote in the local elections. What do you make of this controversy? Was it a routine call for civic participation, or could it be viewed as politically charged?
Well, generally speaking, the encouraging voter participation is consistent with the democratic norms and is not unusual in itself. However, in a highly polarized environment, the interpretation of such statements becomes inherently political. So it depends on how you see it. So supporters tend to frame it as a standard civic message, while the opponent interpret it through the partisan lens, especially when delivered by a sitting president who is inevitably embedded in the ongoing political competition. In that sense, the controversy is less about content of the message is more about context, which is delivered. So in other words, neutrality is difficult to claim when the institutional authority intersects with electoral stakes.
I see. And early voting increased very sharply in several key battleground regions. Which area should we be watching most closely on election night, and why?
I think attention should focus on comparative swinging region, right? Swinging region where the margins are historically narrow and electoral volatility is high. Key area includes the Busan and some districts in the Greater Seoul and Gyeonggi region. These areas often function as the key indicators for national political sentiment. In addition, unusually high early voting increase in specific regions, particularly those showing deviation from past pattern, should be closely monitored. And this shift may signal either effective mobilization or underlying change in voter alignment. Ultimately, these battlegrounds will likely determine the narrative of election before the final national aggregates are fully counted.
All right, you just mentioned Busan, and former presidents were seen joining campaign efforts in battleground regions like Busan, you mentioned, and Daegu. Could their involvement influence undecided voters or affect the outcome of key races?
Yeah, so I think this is kind of the double-edged sword situation. I think that the involvement of a former president adds symbolic weight to the campaigns, particularly in the region like Busan and Daegu, where the partisan identity remains strong. But their influence is primarily organizational and affective. They can means that energize core supporters and reinforce party identity. However, this persuasive power over the undecided voter is more limited in today's issue-driven electoral environment. In tightened contested races, even marginal effect on turnout or enthusiasm can be matter. but it would be an overstatement to suggest that the former president are decisive actors shaping the overall electoral outcome today. Their role is better understood as amplifying existing political dynamics rather than transforming them. So there's very limited role they play for the election.
I see. We'll have to see how that goes. All right. Thank you so much for your time and insight today, Mr. An. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang is set to visit Korea this week, where he's expected to meet with the heads of major conglomerates to discuss cooperation in artificial intelligence and robotics. Ahead of the trip, Huang highlighted robotics as a promising investment area and expressed openness to bringing NVIDIA's flagship GTC AI conference to Korea. Our Lee reports.
NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang has identified robotics as a promising area for future investment in South Korea ahead of his visit to Seoul later this week.
I think that robotics is very important to Korea, and I hope to be able to contribute to robotics in Korea.
Speaking to South Korean reporters in Taipei on Monday, Huang noted that South Korea faces a shrinking workforce despite its strong creativity and innovative capabilities, adding that artificial intelligence and robotics could help the country unlock its full potential. Huang also said he would be willing to bring NVIDIA's flagship AI conference, GTC, to Korea if there is sufficient interest. The event is one of the world's largest gatherings focused on artificial intelligence and emerging technologies. Huang is expected to arrive in Seoul Thursday night and begin a series of meetings Friday with leaders of some of South Korea's largest companies. Industry sources say those expected to participate include SK Group Chairman Choi Tae-won, LG Group Chairman Koo Kang-mo, Naver founder and board chair Lee Hae-jin, and potentially Hyundai Motor Group Executive Chair Chung Hee-sun. The meetings are being closely watched as a possible catalyst for expanded cooperation in artificial intelligence, robotics, and advanced technology development. South Korea is home to several key NVIDIA partners, including memory chip maker SK Hynix, a major supplier of high-bandwidth memory used in AI chips. While Huang declined to confirm who he would meet, he joked that the most important part of his visit would be enjoying Korean food, especially fried chicken and samgyeopsal. His comment has fueled speculation about the potential for another informal gathering similar to last year's widely discussed Ganbu meeting in Seoul's Samsung-dong district, where Huang and the heads of Samsung Electronics and Hyundai Motor met over fried chicken. The casual get-together drew significant attention for bringing together some of the technology industry's most influential figures outside a formal business setting. This time there is growing speculation over whether the visit could include a so-called samgyeopsal meeting, an informal gathering centered around grilled pork belly, soju, and beer. Observers say a similar meeting during this visit could provide insight into the future direction of AI and robotics partnerships between NVIDIA and Korea's leading technology companies. Lee, Arirang News.
Korea's consumer prices for May rose 3.1% year-on-year, marking the steepest increase since March 2024. According to the Ministry of Finance and Economy on Tuesday, the figure returns to the 3% range for the first time in 2 years. Driving the surge was petroleum products, which spiked 24.2%, the highest in nearly 4 years, due to the Middle East conflict. Gasoline and diesel prices jumped 23.1% and 33.3% respectively. Inflationary pressures spilled over into the service sector, pushing international airfares up more than 33%, the highest increase since 1995. The Finance Ministry noted that government interventions, including fuel tax cuts and price caps, suppressed the headline inflation by 0.6 percentage points. Without these measures, May's inflation would have reached 3.7%.
Good morning, I'm Chu Ji-hyun, and this is The World Now. In Kenya, hundreds of people protested in the town of Nanyuki on Monday against a U.S. plan to set up a 50-bed Ebola quarantine facility at a military base there. A local court has temporarily halted the plan following a lawsuit arguing the facility posed a public health risk. U.S. officials said the unit was intended for Americans exposed to Ebola who are still asymptomatic. Residents said military aircraft continued flying in and out of the base over the weekend despite the court order. Separately, global health organization Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations committed $60 million to Moderna and two other groups to develop a vaccine against the Bundibugyo strain of Ebola, for which no approved treatment or vaccine currently exists. There have been 282 confirmed cases in the Republic of Congo and 9 in Uganda. Denmark's Social Democratic leader Mette Frederiksen secured a third consecutive term as prime minister on Monday after forming a center-left minority coalition government. This ends more than 2 months of negotiations following an election in March. Her new government's immediate priorities include diplomatic talks over Greenland, which U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened to annex, and a rapid military buildup as security in Europe deteriorates amid Russia's war in Ukraine. Frederiksen's previous coalition lost its majority in March as voters revolted over a cost of living crisis. AI giant Anthropic filed confidentially for a U.S. initial public offering on Monday, edging ahead of rival OpenAI in the race to reach public markets. The maker of agentic coding assistant Claude Code did not disclose the size or terms of the offering. Anthropic was last valued at just under $1 trillion following a late May funding round. The listing follows Space Explorations Technologies IPO filing targeting a $1.75 trillion valuation. Analysts warn the combined demand for capital from SpaceX, OpenAI, and Anthropic could disrupt capital markets, but filing early carries a significant advantage. Pop singer Dua Lipa and British actor Callum tied the knot on Sunday at Old Marylebone Town Hall in London. Lipa, 30, wore a white Schiaparelli skirt suit and wide-brimmed hat. Turner, 36, wore a custom blue Ferragamo suit. After months of speculation, the couple confirmed their engagement last year. Turner is known for his roles in the Fantastic Beasts films and the Apple TV Plus series Masters of the Air.
While Typhoon Jangmi is tracking toward southern Japan, it's pushing huge amounts of heat and downpours to the southern parts of Korea. The season's first typhoon warning has been issued for offshore waters in the South Sea, while high seas alerts remain in place around Jeju-do Island and southern waters. Eastern Jeju has already seen over 40 millimeters per hour of downpours, with heavy rain warning being issued. Jeju and the south coast could see 20 to 80 millimeters of rainfall, while the rest of the southern provinces could see 5 to 60 millimeters of showers before rain tapers off this afternoon. Meanwhile, central regions are having the opposite story. Under sunny skies, temperatures are soaring to 33 degrees Celsius in the capital, and warmer weather will continue through the local elections tomorrow. However, southern provinces will have lower afternoon highs today, topping out at 27 degrees in Daegu and Gwangju at 29 degrees. Gyeongju, Busan, Jeju will be getting up to 24 degrees. Anyone near the shoreline or out at sea should use extreme caution today.
That's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at noon Korea time. Thanks for watching.